Today I'm going to make an improved version of this circle cutting jig. This was hastily thrown together to make holes for cornhole board. I'm going to fix the set screw so that it's easy to set by hand and doesn't require a wrench. I'm going to improve the sloppiness of the sliding dovetail portion. I'm going to improve the measurement, maybe by inlaying a ruler or some sort of measuring tape. And I'm also going to make another center stripe to this sliding dovetail, I guess, with a straight edge so that I can use this to reference straight edge and route out dados. So this is going to be a combination circle cutting jig as well as a dado cutting jig. So the wood I'm going to use for this project is a small scrap of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood and some hardwood cutoffs. I began drawing the shape of the jig by first making sure the router base was square on the board. Then, using a square, I drew a rectangle about 15 inches long coming off the back. After I drew the design, I took it over to the bandsaw and cut out the shape. Later I would come back with the disc sander to sneak up to the line. With the plywood piece completed, I could begin work on the hardwood pieces that would go underneath. I started with resawing to the correct thickness. So now that I've got my runners squared and flat, I'm going to start cutting the bevels or the angles, whatever you want to call them, in these two side pieces here. And those will go underneath this, leaving a little gap in between for the two center pieces. I'm going to cut both center pieces out of this stock right here. I set the blade to 15 degrees. This angle would allow the sliding middle runner to wedge itself against the side rails. After giving it a test run, I decided to sand out the saw marks left by the blade so that the sliding action would be smoother. Since the runners were complete, I could glue them down to the base of the plywood. I had to be careful during glue up that alignment was correct, so to do this, I put all three pieces on the bottom and centered them by eye. Then I clamped down the center section so that I could use it to align the outer section while I glued and clamped them. I had to be careful not to get glue on the center section. After I glued up the first portion of the dovetail, I used a chisel to scrape out the excess glue so it wouldn't bind up the sliding part later on. While I waited for the glue to dry, I could cut the center sections to length. The glue's completely dried, so now I can trim off the excess with the bandsaw. I decided to trim off the outer edges of the circle where the router will sit because they're not necessary. I was able to get pretty close with the bandsaw, but I decided to use the flush trim bit mounted in my shaper to get a perfect match. The sliding action works great, and now it's time to work on the router mount. I marked the height of the router base on the side of some oak stock. Then I raised the blade to the line and cut out a rabbet the router could slide under. I had to do some chisel work to remove material where the protrusions on the router base were preventing it from seating properly. I drilled and countersunk some holes in the backstop and then glued and screwed it to the base. While I waited for the glue to set up, I worked on the sliding dovetails. The dovetail for cutting circles just needed a short dowel piece in one end, so I drilled a matching hole and glued it in. So the dovetail for the circle cutting portion of this jig is complete. That's super simple. I just have a 3/8 inch dowel glued in there, and it's going to allow the whole jig to travel in a circle. The other one I have to do is for routing the dados. So the idea here is I'm going to have a piece not quite this big, but it's going to sit like this inside of a dado on this dovetail, and it'll ride against the side of the piece I'm cutting the dado in, or in a dado that I've already cut, so I can do a parallel dado to that. I needed to drill an oversized hole in the top so that there would be room for chips to come out. Finding the center point of the hole was made easier by using the router. I used a scrap piece of the sliding dovetail on the backside to minimize blowout. The hole on the opposite end is for a T-nut and the thumb screw that'll later be used to tighten down the sliding dovetail. I made sure to countersink the hole enough so it doesn't interfere with anything, and I secured it with CA glue and activator. Now that assembly is all done, I have all my pieces ready to go. I need to install the ruler on the back side. I'm going to use a cheap $2 Harbor Freight ruler, and I'm going to strip off the cork backing to it and route out a dado or indentation or whatever you want to call it so that it sits flush with the rest of this surface here. I put the ruler flat on the surface and flush with the inner edge so I could trace its position. I only wanted to remove material as thick as the ruler itself, so I used it underneath the router to set up the depth stop. The ruler was attached to the bottom using CA glue again, which if you've never used this, it's great. So the ruler is installed at this point. The only thing left to do is mark my lines. I'm just going to lock it into place using the screw. I'm going to install the router and then cut a circle with it. And I'm going to measure this circle. And whatever the radius of that circle is, I'm going to mark a line that corresponds with this ruler right here.
So here's how the process works. There's definitely simpler ways to cut a circle, but this one's more precise than any I've found so far. First, you use a Forstner bit that matches the size of whatever dowel you use. Then you drill a hole right at the center of the circle. Then, using the jig, you pivot around the center of the hole, removing about half the thickness of the material. Third, you cut through the rest of the material using a jigsaw, bandsaw, scroll saw, whatever you have. Lastly, you use a flush trim bit to remove the rest of the material and match the initial groove left by the router.
So there we go. I'm pretty pleased with how that turned out. It's much better than the first one as far as ease of setup. You can make perfect interior circles or perfect circle cutouts. These both came from the same one, but obviously you can change the way you use it based on what you're trying to do.
And here's the completed circle inside of the cutout, and you can see the empty space is exactly the thickness of the 1/2-inch router bit. Thank you for watching.